Hey, and thanks for tuning in to this video designed for those of you who are teaching on Sunday mornings here at Dayspring. If you're going to be teaching a group of adults on Sunday morning, November the 15th, this video is designed to help you get ready to do that. So let's grab the teaching transcript that you've received and let's look at it together. I'm going to talk you through it a little bit, maybe give you some things to think about as you prepare to teach this week. You should have a copy of it in front of you. It's dated November the 15th. And it goes with our Lord's Prayers sermon series that we're in the middle of. So as you look at it, you'll see on that front page there, you're going to be teaching a lesson out of Matthew chapter 6. And this is a lesson that, as always, accompanies the Sunday sermon. Now, the Sunday sermon this week is going to come to us via a guest preacher. But he's going to be teaching from a passage in the New Testament where Jesus takes some loaves and fishes and multiplies those. So the message he'll be preaching will have to do with God taking what we possess and God using that to advance his kingdom. So you're going to be teaching a complementary lesson from Matthew chapter 6. So let's look at the lesson itself in terms of the teaching content, which starts for you on page 2 of your transcript here. Now, page 2 is just a simple illustration, and obviously you may always have a better illustration to lead into the lesson than what you have here on the transcript. But this is a simple illustration about a couple of actors that you've heard of who turned down roles for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And for somebody like me who really loves the Lord of the Rings, it's kind of curious that somebody would ever have turned down the role of Gandalf or of Aragorn, two of the heroes of this film. But two different actors turned down the roles for two different reasons. And the reason for this opening illustration is just to simply make the point. And it says there on your transcript, kind of down under the gray square in that 2-sentence paragraph there, it says the decisions that we make. It talks about how we make decisions based on priorities. And there's a sentence there that says we make decisions based largely on what we value most in life. And for those two different actors, one turned down the role because he just didn't understand the role. Another turned down the role because there was something more important going on in his life at the time. And that's sort of why this illustration is there, just to make the point that when you think about it, we all make decisions in life. Not this same decision. Nobody asked me to be in the Lord of the Rings. I can't figure out why not. But we all make decisions in life, and the decisions that we make, they go through a filter of priorities. And we look at how that particular decision is going to affect the things that we prioritize. And this is just an opening illustration of that. So look at the full paragraph there at the bottom of page 2 where it talks about what you say at the end of this illustration. It says, in our small groups this morning, we're going to look at an important step in releasing our resources to God. We're going to examine what it means to properly organize our priorities so that we can give up our stuff in order to see the gospel spread throughout the world. So that's what this lesson is about. It's about how do we organize our priorities? Because again, we make decisions based on that filter of priorities. So how do we organize those priorities properly so that we are making the right decision when it comes to investing our resources into the work of God? Now, here's where you go, starting on page 3. You've got a 3-point outline here today to teach. And here's what I would do if I were teaching this lesson. This is one of those lessons where the 3 points that are given to you, if I were a teacher, I don't think I would actually say those points. As in, point number 1 is a principle on priorities. Like that word, a principle on priorities there, or that phrase, a principle on priorities, that would just serve as an organizing guideline for me as the teacher. Because here's what you're going to have in this lesson. You've got 3 points that are made, 1, 2, 3. But inside each of those points, you're going to find a bold print statement of a principle. Those are the 3 points that I would emphasize if I were teaching. Does that make sense? So in other words, you've got point 1, point 2, and point 3. But those 3 points are going to be sort of summarized in a bold print statement. And if I were you, those are the points that I would really encourage everyone to write down or log, or if you write things on the board when you teach, those would be the statements I would write. So let's look at these together. Let's look at the 3 points as they are written, as well as those 3 bold printed statements that you really need to emphasize. So Again, we're asking the question, how can I properly organize my priorities to make sure I'm making the right decisions with my resources? So here they are. Number one, the first point is a principle on priorities, okay? And again, if I were teaching, I wouldn't even say that phrase. I would just know that in my mind, that's what we're talking about here, this priority principle. You're going to go to Matthew chapter 6, and let me read you the verses. Verses 19 through 21 is where you're starting. It says this, and of course this is Jesus talking. He said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, here's the principle on priorities that you're teaching here. Jesus is making a point, and really he's challenging a train of thought in the Jewish culture there, first century. And that train of thought was this, that if you have a lot of things, then that is a sign of God's blessing and God's favor on your life. And to a degree, that is true. But Jesus is really challenging that because he's saying, don't get a lot of stuff. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, and don't accumulate just this large mass of wealth. Now, in doing that, Jesus is challenging a predominant thought of the people, which was, hey, if I can get a lot of stuff, then it'll be proof that I have the favor of God. Jesus is challenging that. And you've got a lot of things there on page 3 and on page 4 that help to flesh out what Jesus was getting at and why he was challenging that. And there's something on page 3, actually, that I want you to look at. Right there in the very middle of the page, look at the paragraph that starts with the words Jesus tells his disciples. Look at what it says. Jesus tells his disciples to avoid storing up earthly treasures. He's disconnecting the assumption of earthly treasures and divine blessing. Otherwise, he would have encouraged his disciples to pursue those things. Instead, he says to avoid such a foolish pursuit. And why is that? Look at the next statement. Logically, Jesus' statement makes sense because material wealth doesn't last. So the priority of principles that you're teaching here is that Jesus is trying to get us to prioritize something that lasts, not something that's temporary. And look over on page 4. There's a great coaching point and a teaching tip there in that little gray box. Because look, as you begin to teach this point, it's going to sound like you're preaching against and teaching against people having stuff and people being wealthy and having material blessings. It may sound like that's where you're going, and in fact, you may inadvertently communicate that if you don't forget the point that you're trying to make. So look at that gray box. It says, don't forget the point. As you're teaching the details of this first point, don't forget the actual point you're trying to make, which is not that material wealth is bad, but that it doesn't merit being the top priority in our lives. That's what you're getting at. Do you really want to prioritize something in your life? Do you want to have as your top priority in life something that's going to go away? Because that's what this whole first point is going to teach. Material stuff doesn't last. It goes away. And that's what Jesus said. He said, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, because that stuff, it rusts, it's destroyed, it's stolen, all this stuff, it just goes away. So the first principle you're teaching, look, here's your bold printed statement for this first point on the bottom of page 4. And you're going to have to think about this one, so I'm going to read it a couple of times. The location of your treasure determines its long-term value. Now let me read it again. The location of your treasure determines its long-term value. You say, okay, Brett, what in the world does that mean? Here's what it means. Think about what you treasure. Think about what you treasure. Where is it going to end up? Like, what's the location? That's what it's talking about when it says the location of your treasure. Where is your treasure eventually going to end up? If your treasure is some material thing, here's the answer to that question. Ultimately, that treasure is going to end up in the dirt. It's going to rust away. It's going to fade away. It's going to die away. Whatever it is. If it's a material possession, that thing is going to end up just kind of disintegrating away and dying. So now with that in mind, look back at our statement again. The location of your treasure determines its long-term value. You see, where something ends up tells you how valuable it is. And here's where this lesson is going, or here's where this first point is going. When you think about it, and this point is made on page 5, when you think about it, there are really only two things that can pass on from this lifetime. Only two things. That is your soul. Your soul has the capacity not just to end up here and to die here. In fact, it's going to live on. Your soul, and number two, the souls of other people. So when you think about it, everything but my soul and your soul and the souls of other people, every other thing is temporary. So the priority, or the principle of the priority, which is your first teaching point, is that we have to learn to prioritize, or more rightly stated, we need to learn not to prioritize things that are just temporary. So that's the whole first point. Are we valuing and prioritizing something that's temporary? If so, we're making a foolish decision. Now this brings you to the second point. Look in the middle of page 5, where you're now going to talk about changing your focus. Okay, so if our focus doesn't need to be on the temporary things, then what does it need to be on? Now this brings you to verses 22 and 23 of Matthew chapter 6. Let me read those to you. Jesus said, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light within you is darkness, then how great is that darkness?" Now, Jesus is using some local, or some idioms, some expressions of the local people. Good eye and bad eye. And a good eye was a reference to someone who was generous. Bad eye was the expression of someone who was not generous. And here's why those expressions came about. Someone with a bad eye is someone who is believed to want this and that and that and that and that. In other words, they want everything. They got a bad eye because it's like on everything. A good eye, by contrast, has a single focus. It's content just to look at this and stay with this. Now, when we talk about changing your focus, here's the bold printed principle that point number 2 has. Look at it right in the middle of page 5. Your heart will focus on whatever your eyes focus on. Now that is an interesting point. And as you teach through it, you're going to see that the Bible talks about having good eyes and bad eyes. And the principle that Jesus teaches is that what you focus on and what you fixate on, your heart is going to drift toward that thing. So what your eyes focus on is going to be what your heart eventually focuses on. And boy, you've got some really good material to teach there in that second point. So point number 1 is that principle of the priority, which says the ultimate destination of what you value determines whether or not you ought to prioritize it. The second thing you're teaching is this. If you're focusing on a lot of things and if you're wanting everything, you need to change that focus. You need to have a singular focus and a singular priority. So what is that going to be? And here's point number 3. Here's your final point, page 6. God should be our singular focus and our top priority. That is it. God should be our singular focus and our top priority. And verse 24 from Matthew 6 is where you're going to make this point. Let me read it to you. Again, Jesus speaking. He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Now, your lesson here is going to get into some technical Greek grammar stuff here. And whether or not you choose to mention Greek and Aramaic and all of those things, that's up to you, whether or not you're comfortable doing it. But I want to explain something very important about verse 24 in Matthew chapter 6. Let me read it to you again, the end part of it. He said, "You cannot serve both God and money." Or if you're reading maybe an older translation, it might say God and mammon, okay? You'll notice something if you're reading from the same translation I am. The word money is capitalized. You cannot serve both God, capital G, and money, capital M. Now, why is that? Here's why. This is where I'm going to get into some Greek stuff with you, okay? When Matthew wrote this statement, and he's recording the words of Jesus, he's writing it in the Greek language. So it's a Greek sentence. But the word money he writes that word in Aramaic. So it's like it's a Greek sentence because it's going to be read by Greek-speaking people. And now all of a sudden he uses an Aramaic word. So this would be like me telling you, here's a great equivalent, and you might even teach it like this. Here's how it would have sounded if Jesus were speaking to me and to you. It would be like him saying, you cannot serve both God and Señor Dinero. Now we would say, Señor Dinero? What is that? Well, imagine if the Spanish-speaking people spoke of money as if it were a person. Then Jesus would be saying, you can't serve God and Mr. Dinero over there. Well, that's how the Aramaic word for money was. It was like saying Mr. Money. So when Jesus is speaking and Matthew's recording it, and it's in all Greek, but now all of a sudden he gets to this one word and it's in Aramaic, you say, why would Matthew stick a foreign word in this sentence? It's because that foreign word was a personal pronoun, Mr. Money. So whether you want to get into the Greek and Aramaic and all of that in teaching, so be it. But I think it is worth pointing out, just like my translation points out, this NIV that I'm reading, that money is spoken of as a personal pronoun here. And that's significant because Jesus is saying you cannot serve him and God. In other words, you can't serve him and him. You have to serve either him or him. And there's a great statement here. And by the way, here's your principle, the bold print principle for this third point, page 6. See it? No one can have two top priorities. No one can have two masters, as Jesus said it. That's why he talked about Mr. Money in contrast to God. Flip over to page 7. I want to read you a statement here. Second full paragraph, talking about why he used the Aramaic word and all of that. It says, well, it seems like Matthew was trying to emphasize that money and its allure can be a lot more than we tend to give it credit for on the surface level. Using the Aramaic expression here, Mr. Mammon or Mr. Money, could have given the Greek hearers and readers a sense that money had a proper name, much like all of the other idols of their day had their own proper names. Look at the next statement. I believe the purpose of Matthew's record of Jesus' statement was to remind the readers of how easily they can be possessed by their possessions. And again, in case you've gotten lost in all of this, Matthew uses a proper pronoun when he talks about money, like Mr. Money, like it's a being. And what I'm saying here in this lesson is that it seems like he's trying to remind us that money can be way more powerful than we give it credit for. It can be like a person who takes control of us. And Jesus is saying you can't have two masters. You can't have money as a priority and have me as a priority, because these are like two different beings. And we're both not going to be content to share you. Okay? You cannot serve him and him. You have to serve either him or him. Does that make sense? So you can't have two top priorities. So here's where this lesson has gone in the 3 points. Number 1, you need to evaluate what you are prioritizing. And you need to ask yourself, is what I'm prioritizing going to disintegrate or rot away or rust or somehow end up in a junkyard? If so, I need to reprioritize things. Point number 2 about changing your focus. You can't have bad eyes. You can't want everything. You need to just focus on one thing, because the Bible says that's a good thing. So the third point, that one thing needs to be God. And we're going to have a tendency for it to be someone else, Mr. Money, but it needs to be God. If we will realize that God is the only one deserving of our devotion, that he is the only one deserving of our time, if he's the only one deserving to be top priority in our life, if we'll come to that recognition, then all of a sudden it becomes easy to release our resources. You know why? Because they're not our top priority. So that's what this lesson is all about, and I hope that really translated well via video. After you teach on page 7, then you move on to the application time where you distribute the handouts. You see all of that here at the very end of your lesson. You've got your conclusion on page 9, which is what you teach once everyone is done working the handouts, and maybe you've had some follow-up discussion there. But this is a really great lesson, because here's the thing. If we are wise, we will take what God has given us and release it. Use it. We'll take what God has put into our hands, whether like loaves and fishes. We'll take it and we'll let God have it, and we'll let God use it for His kingdom purpose. There's great reward in that. If we're foolish, we're going to prioritize things other than God, which means we're going to hang on to them, and we're going to hang on to things that are temporary, things that really were not worth prioritizing. So that's what this lesson is all about. All right. Hey, watch the video again if you need to. Look through your transcript a couple of times, and I hope you have a good time Sunday as you teach through this material, which is very, very important for us all. All right. God bless you. See you Sunday.